one of the most intimidating symbols of the Cold War era, the Berlin Wall. In 1945, when World War II ended, Germany was divided into 4 zones: the UK, US and France, and in the east by the Communist Russia. The 3 occupying the west didn't agree with the Eastern Communist ideals of ruling Germany. The struggle was between 2 main powers, the West and the USSR, or more accurately, capitalism versus communism, and the Cold War was born, East versus West, in an ideological struggle for power. And in 1946, Winston Churchill made his famous speech declaring that the Iron Curtain had fallen, describing the divide between East and West, capitalism versus communism.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is no time for generalities, and I will venture to be precise. A shadow has fallen upon the scenes so lately lighted by the Allied victory. Nobody knows what Soviet Russia and its Communist International Organization intends to do in the immediate future. From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. I do not believe that Soviet Russia desires war. From what I have seen of our Russian friends and allies during the war, I am convinced that there is nothing they admire so much as strength, and there is nothing for which they have less respect than for weakness, especially military weakness. If we adhere faithfully to the Charter of the United Nations and walk forward in sedate and sober strength, seeking no one's land or treasure, seeking to lay no arbitrary control upon the thoughts of men. If all British moral and material forces and convictions are joined with your own in fraternal association, the high roads of the future will be clear, not only for us, but for all, not only for our time, but for a century to come.
To address the growth of communism in Europe, the Marshall Plan was introduced in 1948 by the US, sending aid to help in the rebuilding of post-war. It was thought that by helping the economic situation in Europe, people would be less likely to adopt communism. The plan provided around $13 billion of financial aid, encouraging economic integration and the growth of 3 markets. Stalin, fearing that he might lose his control over Eastern Europe, forbade the satellite states from taking part. US officials concluded that by rebuilding Germany, this was key to sustaining economic growth in Europe, which conflicted with Soviet goal, where they wanted Germany to remain weak and divided so that they could never pose another threat. Knowing that the Soviet powers would never allow German rehabilitation, in 1948 the Allied controls of the West Germany began making plans for an independent West German state. With the threat of the West rallying to oppose communism, Stalin made attempts to secure control in Eastern Europe, covering an area later referred to as the Eastern Bloc. He set up the Communist Information Bureau in September 1947, which was to give him greater control over the satellite states and the ability to enforce compliance and uniformity within the international communist movement. In February 1948, Stalin also sponsored a coup in Czechoslovakia, eliminating the last non-communist government in Eastern Europe. There were subsequent efforts like this by the Soviet Union to ensure the maintenance of control over the Eastern Bloc. On June 24, 1948, Stalin began the Berlin blockade, which halted all ground access to the city in an attempt to get rid of the Americans, British and French. But Truman responded by beginning the Berlin airlift, delivering supplies to the city for 15 months and forcing Stalin to end the blockade. This resulted in the US, UK and France forming an independent German state, the Federal Republic of Germany, to which the Soviets responded 1 month later by forming the GDR in the east. Following this, in 1949, NATO was born to create a united front against Soviet expansionism. It brought together the US, Canada and most of Europe in a defensive pact against the Soviet Union. Consequently, in 1949, Germany was split into two sections, the West and the GDR East Germany. Berlin was also divided into four sections at the end of the Second World War between the four powers. In 1949, two states were founded, the Democratic Federal Republic of Germany in the West and the GDR in the East. Berlin was split also into two parts. Although the Cold War was not an active war as such, small conflicts were turned into proxy wars, East versus West, supporting opposing sides to support their own agendas. The Cold War in the main culminated in the stockpile of nuclear weapons and the ideas of how to use them and how not to use them, how to get rid of them, and the race for the most advanced technology. For a few years after this, people were able to travel between the two halves of Germany. However, many people from the eastern communist side of Germany started to leave to live in the western half due to the deterioration in the economy and the conditions. East Germany was losing almost 100,000 people per year. The divide was commonly referred to as the Iron Curtain, a term describing the political boundary dividing Europe into two separate areas from the end of World War II in 1945 and to the end of the Cold War in 1991. The term symbolises the efforts by the Soviet Union to block itself and its satellite states from open contact with the West and its allies. At midnight on the 13th of August 1961, the GDR stopped the free passage, ordering the border to be closed, and many East Germans were unable to see their relatives and some no longer able to attend their jobs in Western Germany. And this was the beginning of the war, the dividing line of a city, but also a continent and a way of life, but equally the unravelling of allies with different opinions on how to rule a country, which were once united allies by World War II. Now, it's commonly thought that Berlin Wall divided East and West Germany, which it did, but it was actually dividing East and West Berlin. The wall encircled the part of Germany controlled by the West. Berlin is miles and miles away from the division of Germany itself, and all surrounding area of Berlin was Soviet-ruled. So when Germany was divided up at the end of the Second World War, it was carved up into East and West, and so was the capital of Berlin. So the western part of Berlin was, for all intents and purposes, an island in the middle of communist Soviet Union. Now, the barrier was unexpected and it came as a shock to most, but that was by design, to catch the city off guard. 67 of the 81 crossing points were sealed off, with the rest heavily guarded. Barbed wire barriers were erected. East German army forces patrolled the border, which they hadn't been told about until the point of deployment. East Germany was concerned about the response from the US mostly, so no bullets were to be shot into Western territory, only parallel shots, pretty much along the same lines of Russia and NATO within the Ukraine conflict today. The wall was a crude, simple structure, made from materials earmarked for building new accommodation, and the wall was built without foundations. The people building the wall were technically building their own prison. On the east side of the Iron Curtain were the countries that were connected to or influenced by the Soviet Union, whilst on the other side were the countries that were NATO members or nominally neutral. Separate international economic and military alliances were developed on each side of the Iron Curtain. It later became the term for the 7,000 kilometre long or 4,300 mile physical barrier of fences, walls, minefields, watchtowers that divided the East and the West. The Berlin Wall was also a part of this physical barrier. The Brandenburg Gate, which surprisingly survived the war unharmed, stood as a divider between East and West, between communism and capitalism. Initially, the border between West and East was patrolled by East German soldiers, with the permission to shoot any escapees. But in 1961 they erected an 87-mile-long concrete wall with 116 watchtowers, fences, dogs, chain-linked fences and trenches to stop vehicular passage and barbed wire. There was a secondary wall on the eastern side. The gap between these walls was known as the Death Strip, as German guards were ordered to shoot any escapees. There were several checkpoints along this wall, the most famous being the Checkpoint Charlie, which is the only Allied checkpoint and enabled American passage and some Germans, although this wasn't many, and East Germans tended not to be allowed. The Berlin Wall was continually extended until 1975, and it's thought that around 5,000 people actually managed to escape from East to West Germany in the lifespan of the wall. Over 239 people lost their lives trying to get to the West. The first person shot was a 24-year-old tailor who was caught when trying to swim across the canal. A few months later, an 18-year-old was shot whilst scaling the wall close to the Checkpoint Charlie. He lay at the foot of the wall crying for help for a number of hours, but neither side helped, fearing that the other side would open fire, and the man sadly died. By 1963 the wall was so sophisticated that the only way through was by tunnel, but these attempts were often thwarted. East Germany was quite poor, and the wall had continued progress and was made up of a magnitude of many factors, making up many barriers to make up the wall. The Berlin Wall was built on sand, and this was checked for footprints. The wall was painted white to enable escapees to be spotted more easily. Dogs were used to patrol the areas and the wall too, and the East German border guards were presented with flag thanking them for shooting and killing escapees. Guards were always paired with strangers who distrusted one another, and 16 border guards were shot dead whilst doing this job. Around half of them were shot by their partner. In the late 1980s, many Germans started to criticise the existence of the wall. In 1987, Ronald Reagan, President of the US, made a speech at the Berlin Wall, appealing to the communist leader Gorbachev to tear down that wall.
If you seek liberalization, come here to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
In the autumn of 1989, faced with growing financial problems, the reform policy of the Soviet Union under Gorbachev, peaceful demonstrations by Eastern Bloc countries, in particular Poland and Hungary, caused a chain reaction in East Germany. In particular, the Pan-European Picnic in August 1989 set in motion a peaceful development during which the Iron Curtain largely broke. The rulers in the East came under pressure, the Berlin Wall fell, and finally the Eastern Bloc fell apart. GDR citizens who had fled to the West German embassy in Hungary received permission to travel to the West Germany through Austria, and the same happened to East Germans who had taken refuge in the German embassy in Prague. In October 1989, there was a transition of power in the GDR government and a new emigration law was put in place. Although it was read out publicly and processes were still to be put in place, it was mistakenly understood to have been with immediate effect. The news quickly spread through the media that the wall was open. Overwhelmed border guards allowed people through the wall, and German people started to try destroy the wall by hand, coming with hammers and chisels. After 28 years of existence, the wall demolition finally started on 13th of June 1990 and was completed in 1994. On the 1st of July 1990, all permanent border controls were officially removed. The fall of the Berlin Wall paved the way for German reunification, which formally took place on the 3rd of October 1990, which was officially named German Unity Day. This year, former Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev passed away at the age of 91, a man that even until today some Russians criticise for the loss of the Soviet Union, in their eyes a superpower. Mr. Gorbachev, who took over in 1985, is best known for opening up the USSR and bringing the Cold War to a peaceful end. Many Russians blame him and his reformist policies for the country's demise. He was seen by the West as an architect of reform who created conditions for the end of the Cold War in 1991 and brought down the Iron Curtain. He was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1990 for leading role he played in the radical changes in East-West relations and redrawing the political map. So it's bratwurst time, and these aren't like the bratwurst you get in England, are they? Got a different taste. Don't know what it is, but they're really nice. But yeah, but still a consistency of hot dog because I don't eat anything else. There you go, and Coke of course. And we're just waiting, and we're going to go on the bus as soon as our tour comes round.